Welcome, everyone, to the inaugural podcast of the digital side. My name is James Dowd. I am the principal sales architect for Cloud, and I'm here with.
Cliff Madrew. I'm the vice president of our solution architect team.
So, we want to talk about a few things today. Mostly, we want to talk about a video that I found that I sent to Cliff.
Yeah. So I thought it'd be cool to kick off kind of the podcast with just a quick clip that James sent me 2 weeks ago or so. Which is CEO at JP Morgan, and James will kind of give you more details on the individual, but ultimately talking about cybersecurity, talking about scale within the financial industry, and talking about really what it takes to protect information and remain relevant in the industry. And I thought it was just a great way for us to kick things off and dissect what was said a little bit and just talk through it as it relates to our products and where we're going with our portfolio.
So this is actually Mary Callahan Irdos. She is the CEO of Asset and Wealth Management at JP Morgan. So JP Morgan is made up of a whole bunch of different divisions. This is one of the bigger ones. So this is something that I actually saw on the TV, and we'll play it through, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we think.
So I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is today, it is really hard to imagine not being a bank at scale. I can't imagine having to figure out how to protect yourself from a cyber perspective or a technology perspective. We spend $10 billion a year on technology. We have 50,000 technologists. That's the size of like most firms in total. We spend $750 million just on cyber protection. And so to keep up with that is really, really hard.
So I used to work at JP Morgan. I was a consultant there. And, she's talking about, $50 billion, whatever it was that they're spending on security. That could very well just be her particular division, right? So the reach and the size of JP Morgan is astronomically large, right? So the question becomes, and I know, Cliff, you got some ideas about this. What does a smaller bank do, right? Because the reality of the situation is that, and it's not just banks, it's every institution. If you don't have a problem yet, you're either really lucky or you don't know about it.
Right.
Eventually, you're going to have that problem.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things that are really interesting about what she's saying. Number one, absolutely accurate that most banks, most regional banks and other financial institutions don't have that scale. They don't have 50,000 technologists, on hand to help them through
100,000.
Right.
It may just be her division.
Right. But it shows a couple things. Number one, it shows how prevalent this whole transformation around digital, really is in the financial vertical, but as we know with our customers, just across the spectrum. It shows that a company at scale may have the resources to keep up, but from the lens and from what I'm hearing, a company that doesn't have that scale is really going to need the right service providers and the right partners to help them through. And as it relates to cybersecurity, which is also what she was discussing here, it becomes a critical area that a service provider can add a heck of a lot of value to a customer.
So one of the things that I took away from it is how seriously they take the threat, right? So, these are some of the largest institutions in the world, and she's essentially saying that, we have a handle on it, right? But we're not as comfortable as we want to be. We don't feel as confident in our abilities to fix this as we want to be. So we're investing more money every year. We're looking for ways to not only invest internally, but to find a way to have the industry be better. Because if you think about it, right, this is one of those industries where if something were to happen, right, it's not just, hey, a company had a problem. You could have a national security problem. You could have a run on the banks. This is really high stakes. So she's playing in a world where, if there's one problem, the perception of the company and the reputation of the company is hit so hard that the ramifications could not only be stock and money, but regulatory or something horrible happening to the banking system. The other thing that I took away from what she was saying is that if you don't think this way now and you're not trying to keep ahead, things change so fast and things happen so quickly that you'll get caught unawares and you'll have a real bad problem. So, one of the things that I was telling you the story about the YouTube driver, right? So I take a lot of YouTubes, and I was telling Cliff this story about a guy I was driving with. He was a cab driver in Brooklyn. So about 6-7 years ago, him and his brother went out and they bought a hack medallion in New York City. So for people who aren't familiar with that, that's the license you need to drive a cab in Manhattan. And it's very expensive. They spent like $500,000 on buying this license between the two of them so they could drive a cab legally in New York. They did this for a few years. They made good money, to the point where 2-3 years into it, somebody else came to them and said, hey, I want to buy the license from you for $1 million, right? So they would have doubled their money. And they didn't take it, right? They said, all right, we don't want to do that. We don't think it's worth it. Everyone's making money. This is a business. We're going to pass it down to our kids.
Right.
Well, as you all know, as I mentioned Uber came into New York City and completely disrupted that, right? So they weren't thinking ahead. Now, granted, they're not JP Morgan. They're just some guys who drive a cab. But the story, I think, is very relevant because within a year or 2 years, right, their business got completely decimated. That medallion that was worth at one time $1 million, they couldn't sell for $250,000. Right. Now, neither one of them drives cabs. One guy drives Uber and the other guy's a plumber. So that shows you, if you don't really get ahead of it, how fast the technology moves, how fast the landscape changes. It cuts the legs out from under you.
Right.
And you can find yourself in a position where, you think you're going to drive a cab for the rest of your life, and now you don't know what you're doing with yourself,
Right.
To use a metaphor.
Yeah, no, it's a great one. And I mean, it's a true story around, both digital innovation and transformation that just kind of rocked the whole industry, right? That rocked a whole market. And, with Uber in particular, the amount of data that they need to leverage and that they've had to evolve over time, in the beginning it was more of a free-for-all in terms of signing up
Sure.
and background checks and everything else that they went through.
And they
right?
had problems because of that.
Correct. So then they got better at leveraging data, leveraging, interconnected sources of information to do background checking and all of this kind of different ways to deal with the new market, essentially, that they
Sure.
created, and the new platform, I guess is a better way to put it. So I think it's a great example. It ties back in, though, if we just come back to the security side of things and, what was mentioned in the video. This is where I think, Iron Mountain and Ironclad, we found, we're very well positioned in the market in an area that we really focus on. When you look at the solutions that we offer, like critical protection and recovery, which is designed around protecting data from some of the cybersecurity risks that are being mentioned in the video, having that available to the entire market, regardless of how large you are, those are the ways I think that companies can leverage a partner and a provider like an Iron Mountain to ensure that they're able to meet the requirements around protecting their information. And James can probably talk a little bit about some real conversations he's had and what he's seen in the market around how vulnerable most organizations are. And in many cases, depending on who you're speaking with in an organization, that I've found, they don't even see all of the vulnerabilities,
Sure.
depending on, again, where they're sitting within the organization, what their role might be, and how others within their vertical have been impacted. I just sat recently with a very large financial institution that, we were coming right off of the week prior, another large institution had an outage. And so it caused them to really panic and have, their board and their executive team asking them to do a full analysis of their data protection strategy. Could they have an outage? If they had an outage, how vulnerable are they from a cyber risk perspective? And, in speaking with the CTO in that organization, they had identified, we can recover, we can fail over, but we are definitely at risk from a cybersecurity perspective. And this is a very large organization.
So, doesn't that really speak to what she was saying? And also, if you think about it, what the cab driver said, right?
Right.
So, I worked in backup for a long time, and nobody cares about backup, right? Until something goes wrong.
Right.
If you're not getting ahead of it, right? If you're not thinking about it today, you're not going to think about it until you have a bad problem, until something happens. And I think that's exactly what you're describing. You've got an organization that was, oh, hey, everything's good to go, until one day it wasn't.
Right. Right.
And now, if you think about it, from if you're the guy responsible for the business part of that, like I'm the backup guy, whatever, now I have a problem. The day before, I woke up and I was happy-go-lucky. I went to work, I had lunch with my friends, everything was good. Now, today, I'm wondering, do I have a job, right? Because we had a huge breach because I didn't think ahead.
Right.
And I think really that's the point of what she's saying in the video, that not only do you need to think about it, but, for most institutions, it's almost impossible to stay ahead of it doing it yourself,
Yeah.
right? There's so much institutionalized knowledge. There's so much, thought that goes into how to do it, not only on the good guy side, but also on the bad guy side, right? So you know what they say. Every time you fix something, right, people figure out 100 different ways to hack it.
Right.
So there's always this one-upsmanship, this game, right?
Right.
So I do have an interesting story I wouldn't mind telling you about. I call it the black duck egg story. And this kind of illustrates what I'm talking about. And I actually like to tell this story. I tell it in front of people when I speak. So black duck egg story is about a guy named Ira Winkler. He's a security speaker analyst. He's a guy who does cybersecurity. So he was asked to speak at a conference at a research facility, a pharmaceutical research facility in Nebraska. Mm-hmm. Right. So he goes out there and he does this speech, and it's in the middle of nowhere on purpose. They want to isolate the research, right? So he does a speech, and after his speech, he goes, all right, where can we get lunch, right? Ask the people, they go, you know what? We have the best Chinese restaurant in the world, okay? Now, no offense to anybody who's listening in Nebraska, but I promise you, you don't have the best Chinese in the world. Like, I live in Manhattan, and we don't even have the best Chinese in the world, right?
Right.
But he goes, and he has lunch, and indeed, fantastic Chinese food, right? And they have something on the menu called black duck eggs, which I guess are a delicacy, I believe, in Beijing, specific to that region, right? And they're like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like a fertilized egg that they store in vinegar. It's a whole thing, right? And believe me, I'm a guy who likes to eat, and I don't think I would be down on the black duck eggs. It's an acquired taste, right?
Right.
So he goes, and he gets curious, right? And he goes, all right, why do they have this here? So he calls some law enforcement friends, because he's that kind of guy, and they do some research. Well, it turns out that the reason they had black duck eggs there is there were 5 Chinese operatives working in that facility. And that Chinese restaurant, although also a very good Chinese restaurant, was also where the People's Liberation Army was running the operation out of. That was where the handlers worked for the operatives that were inside of this research facility. So, if you're not thinking about threats, and if you're not thinking about how to protect yourself, it's going to come get you. And it's going to get you in the most innocuous way you can think of.
Right.
I don't know if you saw the State Department put out a thing that said, the number one threat to U.S. business right now is insider threats.
Right.
Right. And those insider threats are no longer, some guy in the basement. I'm going to date myself. You probably never even saw this movie, which hurts my feelings. But for the people who are a little more savvy, if you guys remember War Games with Matthew Broderick.
I remember War Games. Yeah.
You don't remember War Games. You saw War Games at some point.
Exactly.
Right? But if you remember, he was just some kid in
Right.
the basement, right? He was working. He was dialing phone numbers. That's not reality anymore.
Right.
These guys are, organized crime. These guys are, Russian federal services. These are people who have unlimited resources. And, you have no way to fight them. You have no offensive weapons.
Right.
All you can think about is, how do I defend myself? And did I build enough infrastructure? Did I build enough process? Did I build enough forethought into the way I'm doing things,
Right.
that if something does happen, I'm going to be safe?
Well, and that concept of an insider threat, right, is one that I think is easy to either dismiss or be blind to.
Sure.
That's the one I think. There are plenty of ways to protect your data, but the reality is, if you're leveraging your own internal resources to do that, the basis of knowledge as to how that protection scheme really works is internal to the organization, and that, to me, in and of itself, is a risk, right? It's a potential way that the data gets compromised, and that has proven to be the fact on many occasions, right? So I forget what the recent statistic was, but it was between 20 and 30%, I think, of attacks.
Well, purposely done,
internal, right? Yep.
So, the way it works, my understanding of the way it works is, these are model employees, right? They go through U.S. universities. You hire them through your normal process. They're great for 5 years. They sit there, they do their job. Hey, Bobby, can you work over the weekend? Sure, boss, whatever you need, right? But then one day, somebody calls them on the phone and says, hey, you're activated. And it turns out that Bobby wasn't an employee at all. Bobby was an intelligence officer, right? And now Bobby's cleaning out your data, or Bobby's, destroying your machines, because that was his job.
Right.
And how do you stop that? How do you even identify that?
Right.
You hired me, biggest mistake you've ever made, but you hired me, right? So we can question, Cliff's taste in employees, but my point being is that you're qualified at some point to determine whether I'm a effective employee within certain job functions.
Right.
But are you qualified to figure out if I am an intelligence officer? It seems like a different set of skills to me. You know what I mean?
It definitely does.
You
Yeah.
know,
That's why we rely on others in the organization to do our background checks.
But who?
and-
But you know what I mean?
yeah.
Like, what background?
Well,
do
the
you check?
psychiatrist that I sent you to probably.
Well, how'd that work out?
Yeah, right.
Right. So.
For that psychoanalysis. I agree and hear what you're saying, and ultimately, if you think just back to our position in the market as Iron Mountain.
Yeah.
We've been known to be trusted to protect and store information, both physical and digital. But with modern day systems comes modern day threats, comes new really ways in which we have to protect our customers' information. That's the purpose of a solution like critical protection and recovery, or CPR as we call it. It's designed around the ultimate protection both from external threats as well as internal threats, to ensure that all of the processes that happen to move the data, to store the data, to take
Sure.
that data offline, to ultimately air gap that data, all happen through this managed service. And you can do a lot of things internally, but you unless you're working with a third party to manage that environment, and honestly, that's only half of the equation. The second half of that equation is where that data actually goes, and I know that that's something that you find to be pretty unique and important around how the information is stored physically.
So, I was having a conversation with a CIO from a bank about 6 months ago, and he said something to me that I've stolen and co-opted, and I'm going to do it again. He said that, there's a difference now. Companies are good at securing their data, right? But it's not enough to secure your data anymore. You have to secure your data store. And what I took that to mean is that, you do all these things that you've been doing for 25 years, right? Backup, DR, disaster recovery. Sorry, my computer wanted to beep. Disaster recovery, password policy, patching, all the stuff that companies do to protect themselves. They're pretty good at that. And most of it works pretty well at this point. But, the way things have changed in, say, the last 5 years, right? It's not enough that your data is safe on your premises. If it's on your premises, it's still vulnerable.
Right.
So the idea is that it's not enough to have that front end secured. You have to secure where the data lives. You have to know and believe that that data is safe if you ever needed it. And what I say when I talk to customers is that you went through all this trouble to back it up, right?
Mm-hmm.
You did all this money, all this hassle, you got all these employees working on it. Can you be 100% confident, right, that if the hits the fan, right, if things go south,
Mm-hmm.
right, that data is going to be there when you need it? Because if it isn't, if you can't be confident, then you might as well not have done the front of it. You might as well just thrown the money in the parking lot and burned it, right?
Right.
I mean that's what you're talking about, and there's an interesting version of that. Bring up this slide with the Ocelot guy.
Yeah, sure.
So this is another story I like to tell, and I love this guy. And I say to people, and you'll see why in a minute, that if you're going to get hacked, right, this is the guy you want to get hacked by. This guy, he looks like a James Bond villain. There you go. There he is. So this is a man that, if you're going to get hacked, this is the guy you want to get hacked by, right? So his name is Yevgeny Bogunichev, right? And he was a member of Pravda, the Russian mob, right? That was his thing. He wasn't political. He wasn't an operative. He was a thief, right? And if you notice, he was a very successful thief because, as I like to say, he not only had money to buy an Ocelot, he had money to buy a matching Ocelot jumpsuit. So if you're going to get hacked, this is the dudes you want to get hacked by. You could at least go home once you're fired, and you can say, you know what, I got taken out by a guy who looks like he's from a James Bond movie. You got to find that silver lining, right?
Right.
So, but this guy did is he was just a thief, right? That's all he did. He had a botnet that stole $100 million, and he just stole data from people, stole bank accounts. That's all he did. Didn't care about your politics, wasn't trying to do anything like that. When the Russians found out, right, the Russian Federal Services, the Federalnaya Slozhiva Bezopasnosky. Now, my daughter actually takes Russian in school. She's a Russian major. She wants to do something for the State Department, but she says I butcher that. But for most people, that sounds like I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you
so.
most definitely butchered that.
So, be that as it may, this is the real Russian security services, like their FBI, right? So when they found out about it, they didn't shut it down. They had no interest in shutting it down. What they said to Mr. Bogachev is that you now will allow us to access your botnet. And they did. So they went in there, and this guy was just a thief, right? They went in there, and they stole every bit of data they can get their hands on. Blackmail agents, steal money, whatever they wanted to do. So, my point is that if you're not secure in where the data is, if you're not secure that the data is protected, you're going to run into a threat that you have no ability to stop. Who are you going to call? The FBI? What are you going to do to the Russians?
Right.
You got to make sure that the data lives in a place where the data has its own security around it,
Right.
not just your front end stuff.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, do we want to talk about kind of just pivoting to how we try to do that?
Sure.
At Iron Mountain and some of our capabilities.
So the strongest thing we bring to the table, and I know that this is, at least here, it's kind of beating a dead horse because we talk about it a lot, but it is our single biggest differentiator, which is the security of the physical data storage, right? So from a technology standpoint, especially on our archival stuff, or what people will call IronCloud, right? IronCloud is technologically pretty much the same, right? And that's done on purpose. We want to make sure that we have interoperability with all these products. We don't want to be different that you can't use us, right? Where we're different is where your data actually lives, right? So I know a lot of employees have heard about Boyers, a lot of employees have heard about the undergrounds. That's super important to us. Those facilities are some of the most secure places in the world, right? So, years and years and years ago, when I was a younger guy, I worked in classified naval data centers. These data centers that we keep cloud storage in, customer cloud data in, are as close to that military style experience as you're going to get in the commercial realm. And I don't care if you're a JP Morgan or if you're, some guy with a computer store down the street or a hair salon. It doesn't matter how big the organization is. It doesn't matter how robust their data centers are. Our data centers where that cloud data lives are as good as it's going to get before you get to like the NSA and stuff like that.
Right.
And for most people, that's enough. I mean, you don't need the NSA.
Yeah, I think one thing and I actually got called out on this with a customer, another large institution, that commented, actually, listen, I think you guys, we've done a tour of Boyers. We understand your physical security. It's top notch. It's better than we have at our own facilities. But today is about digital threats as well. And tell me about what you do from a logical standpoint. How do you protect the data right from the network? That's where we added even more value in terms of how well thought out the architecture of our solutions is, and whether it's something simple like object storage, where you're just connecting to a cloud to archive data, to store long-term retention or compliance data. As simple as that process may seem, there's a lot of complexities. As you know, on the solution architecture side of things, this is what we do. Working through network, working through bandwidth requirements, working through all of those things. But on the security side, even just ensuring encryption on the data, ensuring that only an authorized machine or user has access to that data, that can get rather complex if you're doing, the DIY cloud within a hyperscale provider. And that's another thing that I've found it resonates very well in talking with customer conversations, but we take that to the next level. So when you look at just object storage, sure, it's simple. We ensure encryption on the data. We lock it down. We have a zero trust model, which ensures that we're only allowing that authorized customer to access the information that is not ever on the public internet, if you will. But then when you get into a solution like CPR, now you're also bringing in the concept of taking that data offline and how you're doing essentially a pull or extraction of that data from the customer environment. So
CPR is a good example but the bigger issue is that none of this exists in a vacuum, right? So that's kind of what I hope that's coming across here is that, yeah, it's wonderful that there's physical controls. Right. It's wonderful that there's a digital set of controls. It's wonderful that you've thought through all these logical things, right? Mm-hmm. But if you do them as discrete items, right, where they don't connect together, you have vulnerabilities. So let's say that those are the three pillars, right? You're going to do physical, you're going to do, a logical separation, and you're going to do digital protection, right? Mm-hmm. So you're going to do virus scanning, intrusion detection, right? Right. If you do any one of those three things, right, you're better off than not doing any of them, right? Mm-hmm. But if you don't do all three, you're still vulnerable on the other two or whatever you haven't done. Right. Right. So that's one of the challenges that we think we fix, right? So CPR is a good example. Yeah. So I think we should step back for a second, right? Because people might not know the data center, they might not know what CPR is, right? So when we talk about our data centers, they're the mountain part of Iron Mountain for the most part. They're undergrounds. We have three of them that are cloud specific. Two of them are underground. One is the third one is in Manassas, Virginia. That's in the federal corridor. So that's built to be at a DoD setback. It's built to a very specific set of standards. That's where the data lives. And it's there, for the most part, redundant across all three. That's one of the things that we do a little differently too. That's important because there are a lot of federal customers who exist in these facilities, right? So the only ones we can talk about are Social Security and the Patent Office, right? But I've been down, especially to Boyers, a whole bunch of times, and there are a lot of more interesting three-letter agencies that are down there. And the reason that that's important is because our facilities carry national security designation. So as you know, if something were to happen, we get services restored like a military base, which is kind of cool.
Right.
And what's even cooler, if you've been there used to be, they made it a little more civilized. They put the visitor center at Boyers. But when I first started going there, it was just a guard booth, right? And in the guard booth, they had a rack of like M16s back there. That was pretty cool.
Yeah,
So,
well, and guards carrying them, right?
right. You felt like you were going into like a whole thing. So
Yeah.
that was kind of cool.
Yeah. Should we talk just a little bit about, our whole premise of the cloud is built a lot around different certifications and standards. One of those being NIST.
Sure.
Their framework around cybersecurity and protection of digital information. Should we just talk a little bit about, and maybe we can share that
Sure.
framework and just
Yeah,
talk about
definitely.
how we fit in. So hang on one sec. Let me flip that over.
Just while you're doing that. So NIST is a government framework around security, right? So it tells companies how to secure their data to be compliant for certain things that they want to do. And this is a weird one because you actually build to the level of security that you're looking for. So I worked in a classified facility, and the NIST standard for a classified facility is different if you want to do classified work than it is if you're just a regular company. But it's all built on the same kind of frameworks, right? So you want to identify your threats, you want to protect against them, you want to know how to detect them and how to respond to them. And a lot of companies are good with that, right? But the final part of it is recovering, right? So most people, if you say, hey, how do I recover? So this is kind of a transition to CPR a little bit. But if you go and you say, all right, I'm going to recover my data, most people think that's disaster recovery, which is something you might have heard, a term you might have heard thrown around. What that essentially means is that you have a secondary copy of your physical environment where you're putting your data every day. If there's a disaster, you can lose your primary, you can come up and you can run on your secondary copy, which is cool for most organizations, and it's been good for a long time. But the problem is now that a lot of these malware and viruses are targeting those disaster recovery systems as well. So one of the things that happens that affects the ability to recover, for example, there was a virus that got out a couple of years ago called NotPetya. So NotPetya was a weapon that was designed by the Russians to attack the Ukraine. And it was kind of a super virus. It was everything that they knew about malware and viruses and really everything that they had done research-wise in one payload that was sent out. It was designed to be destructive, it was designed to move fast, it was designed to replicate itself, and it was very hard to stop, right? So you ended up with a situation where this thing attacked the Ukraine and it did what it was supposed to do. Took out infrastructure, power plants, did all those things. It was literally a weaponized virus. But it got out into the wild, right?
Right.
And it affected Maersk shipping. That was the one that got affected the hardest, right?
Yep.
And they lost a lot of things, right? Including stuff you don't think of, like their router tables got corrupted.
Right.
But while disaster recovery, those DR systems are good for 80% of the scenarios, in this particular scenario, one of the things that NotPetya did was it went through and it destroyed the boot record on every machine that it attacked. So it went out, it destroyed the primary data, it destroyed the backup data, and then it also destroyed the ability for you to boot the systems that you were depending on for your disaster recovery. So you essentially lost the ability to recover.
Right.
And that's why a lot of companies are falling down on the recover aspect of NIST.
Yeah, so the NIST cybersecurity framework, if you're just listening to this, obviously you're not seeing the slide, but it's really broken down into 5 key areas. So just, again, if you're listening, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And so what ultimately James is saying is that it's very possible to put the best protection in place, the best detection mechanisms, have a written document around response. But if you don't have a plan that truly gives you the ability to recover outside of your existing environment.
And in fact, most companies are really good at that.
Right.
The first 4 steps there.
Right.
That's something people have been doing for a very long time.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a good component of the spend that was mentioned on the
sure.
JP Morgan video around the $750 million, I think,
It was
spent
something
annually.
crazy.
Yeah, something crazy like that, right? And again, this is an area that that we think is one of the most critical in terms of worst case scenarios.
Sure.
And that we bring a lot to the table.
So that does beg the question, what do we bring to the table, right? What's our actual solution? So we've said the word CPR a couple of times, critical protection recovery. That is our name for what most people call cyber recovery or isolated recovery, which is an air gap, right?
Right.
So you know what an air gap is, but for the sake of the audience, you want to tell them what an air gap is?
Yeah, sure. And this is where I'll have a difference of opinions from different people, right, in terms of truly defining an air gap. But ultimately, what we're talking about is having that complete network isolation, that logical isolation that really plays back into even potentially a physical isolation,
Sure.
which can be done logically, right, in the ways in which we do it with CPR. But it ensures that the source system and the destination system are not on the same network together, right? And that's ultimately how the industry has adopted the term. The reality of the term is really complete physical isolation. So
Yeah, that came out of a government.
Right.
Yeah, you know, when I did it, when I was doing it back in the day, when we ran, you know this, but there are different levels of government data. So there's no foreign, there's confidential, there's classified, and there's special access.
Mm-hmm.
When we would run, say, a classified, right, not only did every piece of physical hardware have to be isolated, so its own switches, its own network cables, but even when you ran the conduit, for classified, you couldn't use flanged conduit. The conduit, they couldn't be screwed in, they had to be welded. So it had to be a single piece of conduit that ran the wires. It was a very big deal to do air gap for classified.
right,
That's not exactly this. This is more of a commercial version of it.
right,
But to your point, one of the big characteristics is that there is a separation, and by nature a separation when you come to Iron Mountain between your network and ours.
right,
And being able to sever that connection is what creates the air gap.
right.
And that's a lot of what we're doing here. So we call it a logical air gap, but for the purposes of what 99% of the companies in the world are going to do, it's good enough.
It definitely is, and it's not as if it's just taking an extension of your network down, right? These are two completely independent domains, completely independent networks.
Yep.
Where we're ultimately capturing data. We're providing the right tools and technology to
Full automation.
to automate that capture of the data, to randomize that capture of the data, to do it at a random point in time so it's unpredictable. Then ultimately moving that data to our secure facility
Robust
via
encryption.
a network with robust encryption, of course, and then being able to sever that connection, if you will,
Sure.
and ensure that the data is protected in a worm state, right? Right one,
non-volatile.
non-volatile, yeah, or
Immutable copy.
Immutable
Right.
is the right word, actually. So again, all of that being a component of the solution, all of that being critical to developing a process to enable you to recover, and that is really the intent. Right?
So, what I say, half jokingly to customers, I think it's a good illustration of this. I was in a meeting in Atlanta, and my wife and my kid came down because we were going to drive down to Florida to see my daughter in college. But when I was in the meeting, they decided they were going to go out, right? So they went to the Coca-Cola factory. Ever go to the Coca-Cola factory?
I have not.
All right, I've never been there either. My wife and kids have been there. I've never been there. So, in the Coca-Cola factory, I'm told, right, there is a copy of the Coca-Cola recipe, right, and it's like down behind glass in a vault, and you can see it from a distance, right. And ostensibly, that is the only copy of the Coca-Cola recipe that exists. Now, I don't actually believe that, but for the sake of this particular conversation, let's pretend that that's the truth, that Coke's not lying to us, right? So what I say to customers, right, is if Coca-Cola were to lose the recipe to Coke, right, and they couldn't make Coca-Cola anymore,
Right.
all they can make is Sprite, right, or 7-Up, whatever they make on the other side, would they still be Coca-Cola, right? The answer is no. Nobody says, Sprite. Coca-Cola is Coca-Cola, right? That's the kind of data that goes in here, right? And once it's in here, it's air-gapped, it can't be accessed, and it can't be changed. So even if you were to have a complete disaster on your primary system, your backup system, and your DR system's gone, right? You still have this data. And what's important about it is it's not just a physical gap, right? That's a big part of this, but there's also what I call an administrative gap, right?
Right.
The idea being that, your people, right? And this is kind of an important point too. You worked internal IT. Did you ever work internal engineering?
Yeah.
All right. So you probably know this too. So I was an engineer for a long time, right? Before I went into the dark side of doing sales, right? But I was an internal engineer for a long time.
Yep.
Right? And I ran a team, an open source team in a very large company.
Yep.
But we were only responsible for Linux, Unix, and VMware.
Right.
That was it.
That was it.
Right.
Right.
However, I worked there 7 years, right? By the time I left, because people would call at 3 o'clock in the morning, this is not working, that's not working. Hey, James, can you help out? Sure. By the time I left, I knew everything there was to know about my stuff, right? Plus the Windows environment and the AD environment,
Right.
and the Outlook environment, rather the Exchange environment, and the switching environment, and this and that. I knew everything.
Right.
I could have, if I wanted to, destroyed that company from the inside, including the backup systems. Like I had access to all that too, right?
Right.
I promise you, in every company that we speak to, and every company that we'll ever come in contact with, there are people like that, right? So if you have a malicious actor that you've given that kind of access to, right? Doesn't matter what you've done, they'll destroy it.
Agreed.
If you come into an air gap solution, especially a third-party air gap solution, where a third party controls that copy of the data,
Right.
you have an administrative gap. Your people can destroy everything on your side, right? But they can't access our stuff.
Correct.
And I'm not saying it's impossible that our people couldn't also be out of their minds and they could destroy everything that we have, but they can't access the other side of the house.
Correct.
So one copy of the data will always survive, because the reality is you could compromise one organization. The ability to compromise two organizations becomes almost,
It's
statistically
exponentially.
impossible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really the advantage of doing it offsite.
Yeah, and agreed. And one of the things too, I just want to, as you started into that, just talking around the secret recipe, if you will, right?
Sure.
And the difference between what I brought up on the screen for those that are watching the video, what we kind of call the data protection pyramid, if you will, or I like to call it the data protection mountain.
The pyramid of protection.
The pyramid of protection is better. Yeah, alliteration's good. The difference between kind of your archival data set, your backup, right, your disaster recovery, which you walked through as you were telling the story, and what really should be considered for what the industry has kind of deemed the term around isolated recovery, which is what our CPR solution is intended to solve for. It's very important that you're understanding the type of data that really requires this level of protection. The secret recipe, if you will, the customer database that if was lost you would never be able to
You're
recover.
not looking for
Right.
pictures of the last company picture.
Right, exactly. So, and that can be a challenge for organizations as well, just trying to identify and understand their data. What data truly makes that up, right? That's where some of the advisory services and things like that we can offer customers becomes very critical. So.
I don't think it's just critical. I think it's imperative. I think that a lot of the value we add in these discussions is understanding, what data you have, right?
Mm-hmm.
What data you need to keep, what data, and it's really individual to your business. What data, if all hell breaks loose, right?
Mm-hmm.
What data do you need to either return to service, or if you become defunct as an entity, satisfy your escrow and regulatory requirements?
Right.
The answer is different for everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we have the services, IDGS in particular, has services to come in and help you with that information. And that's a big part of the value add of this. It's not just, hey, we're going to put data in here. It's what data is important and what do we do with the data.
Yeah.
And that's really something that I think, from a company standpoint, we're moving toward that anyway.
Yeah,
I
we really are. I mean, you look at, so we have our IGDS that you just mentioned, our Information Governance and Digital Solutions group within Iron Mountain, coming together across our digital portfolio of services. It allows us to come in and talk to a customer and really help them through that entire journey as they think about, actually, as we have the pyramid up here, right, as they think about both how do I identify data that is archival in nature, right, what kind of tools can I use to ensure that data is appropriately protected and archived. The great part about that lead-in is once you've identified the data that needs to be kept, you're also identifying the data that you no longer need to retain, the data that may be putting you at risk, the data that's consuming expensive primary storage.
Or a discovery risk, or
Right.
somebody's going to ask for it in a lawsuit. Sure.
Right, and then and we'll probably talk about that in a future episode in some more details. But once you identify that, then it's kind of, all right, once that's appropriately archived, once it's properly protected and it's not changing, so you can typically move that data into a lower cost tier. Now you focus on what data needs to be back up for operational recovery, right? And that's kind of, you're actively changing data. And then of that data subset, how much of it, you now have a backup copy. What is your disaster recovery SLAs? So do you need to implement additional solutions to give you a better recovery time and recovery point objective for some of that data? It may not be all of it. And then further honing down in on what is that absolute mission critical data that requires an isolated
So
recovery
I'm
strategy.
going to steal a quote, and I don't remember who said it, but there was somebody who said that there's a tremendous amount of information, or I'm sorry, a tremendous amount of data,
Yeah.
but not a lot of information, right? People don't know what they have. There's no
Right.
knowledge around it.
Right.
So even to your point, we talked about the dark data a couple months ago. Remember our dark data conversation?
I have a dark data T-shirt on.
Or a
I
dark
don't know
data
if you can see
T-shirt
that.
on. So dark data, and I actually spent the month before Christmas coming up with a backstory for the creature we called the dark data. We were going to put him into an ad campaign as like a comic book.
Mhm.
So my ability to draw is non-existent, but I made up this whole thing with the dark data, so it's kind of near and dear to my heart. But and maybe we'll share some of my horrible drawings in another episode. But the idea is that people have this tremendous well of information, right? But they have no idea what's in it. And one of the things I think we'll talk about in the future is like what we can do with that data, data lakes and whatnot. But
Data analytics, right?
Data
Business- I
analytics,
mean,
sure.
we literally just launched, the MVP of a platform,
Sure.
Our Insights platform, to enable analytics on the data. So that's something we'll definitely talk about in more
but
detail.
another bolt-on to using that data.
Absolutely.
But
yeah.
one of the things that's really important, and Insight it's important for too, is the idea of clean data, right?
Right.
So people talk about data lakes, but there's this new idea of clean data lakes, right? So you only want the data that's particularly relevant to a situation. So for CPR, you're only looking for the critical, you're kind of distilling this giant thing down
Right.
into a point, right?
Right.
Where this is the 10 things I need
Right.
to run my company.
Yep.
And that kind of exercise and that kind of intelligence, it's going to become more important, and it's going to become more important not only across our product portfolio, but in the industry in general.
Right.
Because if you think about it, almost every one of our products can benefit from that.
Right.
Like even backup, like something as innocuous and simple as backup. Right now, I back up 500 machines, right? Well, it turns out, and we get this all the time when we do analysis, 30% of those machines are completely redundant.
Right.
I need them for production, right? I need to know I have multiple ADs and multiple this, right? But I don't need that in disaster recovery or backup. I only need one copy of the data.
Right.
Identifying the relevant data out of that giant cloud of dark data is not only incredibly valuable to the customer, but it's incredibly valuable for us as a value-added solution. It drives value, it drives revenue, but it also makes our solutions look. I believe in what we do now, and I think we have a quality solution, but it enhances the perception of its value. Like people are like, oh, that's something I didn't think of myself. That's
Right.
that's extra that you're giving me.
Yep.
And that's a big part of how we can drive forward with business and really, reinforce the fact that Iron Mountain is a partner that can help you not only, put stuff in a box or throw data into a place, but give you a complete life cycle management, understanding all that stuff.
I mean, it's really who we've been on the physical side and who we are today on the digital side,
Yes.
and how we're transforming as an organization in our whole services portfolio for our customers. So I think on that note, it's probably a good time to wrap things
So,
up.
let me leave them with one other thought, and then
Sure.
and this will be my wrap-up thought, right? So another reason that you shouldn't store your data, especially your backup and archive data or your critical protection data, on site, right? If you take your data, and it doesn't matter if you have multiple data centers, it doesn't matter. If you take your data and you put it anywhere near the people who are responsible for the production data, if you give one person access to all that data, no matter what you do to secure it, you still have a problem. So for example, if you take this data and you put it into a Faraday cage, right? I don't know if everybody's familiar with that, but a Faraday cage is an RF cage that goes around a machine, cuts off all ability to communicate. So no signals get in, no signals get out. It's supposed to be the height of security, can't be more secure. Well, there's a guy named Mordecai Geary. He's another researcher, and he specializes in stealing data from Faraday cages. So if he has physical access, no matter what you've done, if he can see the machines, not that he's accessing them on a keyboard, if he can see them or hear them, he can steal your data.
Yeah.
He reads the light signatures from the way the discs blink, the way the noise is in the machine when it's processing, the heat signatures of the machine. He can use all of that information to reconstruct and steal your data.
Yeah, and I've read articles on hackers who have been able to similarly leverage if there is any type of speaker installed to be able to
Any kind of
communicate
leakage of-
bidirectionally, right? Input and output data to a machine to hack it through infrared camera pulses, reading some elements of the screen and transmitting data. It's pretty
So
incredible.
if you give anybody access to your data, right?
Yeah.
If you keep your data, your critical recovery protection data,
Yeah.
anywhere near your primary or backup data, and you give those same people any kind of access, even if they can just see it across the room, you still potentially have a problem. If you move it into a facility like Iron Mountain, no one will ever touch it again until you need it.
Right.
And that is a level of protection that you cannot get in your own data centers, no matter what you do.
Right.
So that's my final thought for the day.
That's a good final thought, and I'm going to final your final thought just by putting my
Always got to one-up me, Cliff.
well, the last thing I want to talk about is just kind of putting your money where your mouth is, right? So the fact that we're not just talking about protecting information, that we're actually doing this for organizations today, and we just had a deal come through which involves replicating data to our Ironcloud, to our cloud data replication solution, and then taking a copy of that data down to tape. So, and you're very familiar with
Yes.
that deal. You just want to talk very high level, very quick, just so that everyone can understand. I mean, this is something that we're really truly doing for organizations today.
Deep storage.
In that case, doing the tape out, if you will, as a component of the cloud, what we call our deep storage capability within Ironcloud, and just for this particular organization, what the value of that really meant.
So, I mean, deep storage tape is a funny animal, right? So for a long time, tape was a dirty word. People didn't want to deal with tape. But the reality is tape is cheap and it's reliable, right? And it's kind of having a second life here, and this is an example of it. Tape, by its nature, right, it's written to tape. When you write data to tape and you take it offline and you put it in a physical vault, right? By its nature, it's air gap and immutable, right? You cannot touch or alter that data unless you physically compromise the media and reload it.
Right.
People are using tape as sort of a poor man's air gap, but they're also using it as a very cheap way to store data that they very infrequently access, data that they don't touch. And what's kind of cool about it is that we're leveraging the fact that we do tape pretty well, right, to give them a very cloud-like experience. So you're going to replicate your data like you normally would, and then we're going to take it, we're going to put it on tape.
Right.
But as far as they're concerned, that's a service.
All as a service.
Right?
Yep.
It looks like a cloud service. It's priced like a cloud service.
Right.
It's physically not. I mean, we're doing something different underneath, right? But as far as they know, they're getting data cheaper than what you would get on Glacier, right? And they're getting data that's more reliable if there was a disaster.
Right.
Like nobody can compromise. You'd have to break into our facility, which is next to impossible.
Right.
And even if you did, you'd have to find the tape, which is also next to impossible.
Right.
Talking about millions of square feet of warehouse space.
And you'd have to have access to the catalog and the encryption keys and everything.
All
else,
that
right?
stuff.
All of that.
But
Yep.
the point
Yep.
being, from a customer side, all they see is the ease of use and the security.
Yep.
And the cloud-like pricing and the evergreen nature of it.
Right.
No more equipment to buy, no more capacity planning, no more uplifts, no more having to deal with upgrading either a tape library, right? Or the thing that people don't think about, and I think it's kind of lost in this conversation, I have all this data I need to store. I only have so much primary disk to store it to.
Right.
Like I bought a data domain, it's only so big, right? Well, I can take that data indefinitely and move it onto tape, right? As long as I don't expire it out of the catalog, it can exist on tape forever.
Right.
And I don't have to keep increasing the size of my data domain. It takes customers out of the business of doing hardware upgrades, out of the business of doing capacity planning, and most important to a customer, out of the business of miscalculating their capital. Right. So if I buy for a 5-year stretch and 2 years in I'm out of space, well, that makes me look like an idiot as a manager. I have to go and say, well, I made a mistake. I need a lot more capital.
Right.
We can take that away. They never need to worry about that again.
Right.
And they will never compromise security, and it's as easy to use as any other cloud service.
Yeah, no, that the scalability, the predictability, right, and being able to.
It's how we close this deal. So this particular industry is regulated. They're a utility.
Right.
They have strict regulation around compliance and storage, and they didn't want to have to store data that they are literally never going to touch again.
Right. But it has to be
On
retained.
a super expensive solution. We gave them a nice, cheap way to do it, super secure, very easy for them to use without all the complications of, and the hassle even of having some poor guy have to change tapes, which I did for the beginning of my career, which is nightmarish.
Or just add, disk capacity over and over again, over how many years, right?
Or work over Thanksgiving or Christmas to do an uplift.
do it,
that
right.
happened
Yeah.
too. All that goes away.
Yeah, it's great. All right. Well, on that note, we made it
promised
through.
this time. This
Yes.
is the actual last
We have made it to the
Right.
end of this episode. Truly appreciate it. If anyone has made it through this journey with us to the end.
If you stuck with us in our rambling, we appreciate it.
And we'll hope to kind of put these out consistently if they're well received. So thank you again for your time.
And if you run into us in the cafeteria, come over. We're happy to sign autographs, whatever you guys want from us. We're here for you.
Oh boy, I might be flying solo on the next episode. Just kidding. All right.
Hey man, I'm the talent.
All right. Thank you much.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.
All right. Bye.